Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our air conditioning condenser. That's going to be located right up along the front of the vehicle, behind the bumper. Before we go ahead and start taking anything apart, you're going to want to make sure that you evacuate all the refrigerant inside the system. It is going to be under pressure, so you need to be very careful. And of course, throughout the entire process, hand and eye protection. Let's get started by getting underneath the front of the vehicle. From under the vehicle, let's go ahead and take down this splash shield right here. For this, if you were to look along each side of it, you're going to find several T25 headed screws. For those, I'm going to use this star bit right here, a T25. Let's go ahead and start taking all of them out. Once all your screws are out, go ahead and carefully pull it down, give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Now that we have that out of the way, let's move along to a couple other screws. Looking along the bumper cover, you're going to find several that are supposed to make their way all the way across the front. And then if you were to continue looking up inside of each of the wheel wells, you're going to find several others. Let's just go ahead and start removing all of them. All right, we can do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Now let's make our way back underneath the hood. We're going to continue on by removing the 4 mounting screws that you can see up along the top of the grille. Now the next thing you want to do is carefully grab onto the grille itself. We're going to start pulling it away from the body here. Now you're going to notice it starts flexing down along the bottom. If you were to flex it just enough to see inside, you're going to find that there's a whole bunch of little tabs. Generally, all I want to do is try to reach inside the grille. I'm going to try to hook my fingers onto it, and I'm going to gently press up against the bumper while I try to pull it away. You want to be very careful not to flex your grille too much, in which case you might break it. Sometimes that can be a little harder. You can go ahead and set that aside. Looking along the bottom, you can see all the little tabs. And then you can also see the exact area where they need to press into. Now let's continue on up along this area here. To remove these, you're going to use a T30 Torx bit. There's one here, one in the center, and one on the other side. Now we can grab onto the bumper cover up along the top, and generally I reach into the bottom lower grille. I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto this. We're going to give it a little wiggle and start removing it from the body of the vehicle, being very careful not to damage the paint along the way. Now looking behind this, if you happen to have some fog lights, you're going to want to go ahead and disconnect that. Okay, with the bumper cover out of the way, the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and remove this entire bumper from the area. That's going to give us clear access to the AC condenser, which is located directly behind it. To start getting this out of the way, there's a couple things that we're going to want to pay attention to. There is an air temp sensor that we're going to disconnect, but there's also a whole bunch of mounting bolts. Let's start right up along the center here with these 2 mounting nuts. We're going to use a 10mm to remove the pair. Underneath the bumper, you're going to find the air temp sensor that I mentioned. There's 2 ways of removing this. Either go ahead and disconnect it by squeezing this tab and pulling it off. Sometimes they get stuck. Or you can come right along here. I'm going to use a 10mm headed socket. We'll slide it right over these 3 ears, gently press. It's going to squeeze them together, and we'll pull it out towards the condenser. We'll give that air temp sensor a quick inspection, make sure it looks okay, and then of course we'll set it aside. Now let's apply a little bit of support underneath this area. Keep in mind that the majority of it is only plastic, and then what's above that, you're going to have your AC condenser and of course the radiator on the back side of that AC condenser. Basically, you don't want to crush any of it. Let's just apply a little bit of pressure just to hold it up. Now the next thing I want to do is take another jack, and I'm going to come right up in front of this bumper right here because we're going to have to make our way to either side and start removing some bolts so we can get this right out of the way. Let's carefully apply a slight amount of pressure underneath the bumper foam in the front. Now we can move along to each side and we can start removing the rest of our mounting bolts. So as you look at the mounting bolts for this, you're going to find that you have 4 larger bolts. But if you look a little closer, you're also going to find that you have 2 more T30 Torx bit screws on each side. Let's start by removing the Torx bit screws. To remove these, we're going to use a 16mm socket. I like to leave one of my bolts in on the first side that I remove, and then of course I'll fully remove the other side, and then we can remove the entire bumper. All right, now that I have it all unbolted, I'm going to carefully remove it from the vehicle. Okay, with all that out of the way, we have a nice clear view of our AC condenser right along here. We're going to move along to the AC condenser refrigerant lines. Now keep in mind, you needed to have evacuated all the refrigerant from inside of the system. If you did not, do not open up either of these lines. It's super important and unsafe. Now with that said, let's go ahead and start removing these bolts from the center to go ahead and remove them from the AC condenser. Even if you did evacuate the refrigerant, there could still be a little bit of pressure. We'll use a T45 to remove each of these bolts. All right, you could hear a little bit of pressure behind that one. Nothing to worry about. The next thing we're going to do is remove these from along the side. Looking at them, you're going to find two mounting points for each. For these, I'm just going to use a flat screwdriver. Stick it right in here up along the top. We're going to grab onto the clip, gently pull it downward, and we can pull it away. The second one's going to be located behind this flap right here. You just come in from an angle, do the same thing. Pull it down, pull it away, give it a quick inspection, set it aside, do the exact same thing on the other side. Now we're going to continue on to our 4 T30 Torx screws. You're going to find one in this lower circular hole. Following it up, you have another circular hole. And then you have the exact same thing on the other side. Let's remove all 4 of these T30 Torx bit screws. So now at this point, you can carefully wiggle this around, but we don't want to move it around too much because of course the radiator is located directly behind it. Now with that said, what we're going to do is move along to these bolts right here. We're going to continue on with our T30 Torx bit. We'll remove this side, the same on the other side. That's going to make it so the radiator can push back a little bit, and we can go ahead and twist this, being very careful for the radiator behind it, to remove this from the vehicle. Now I'm just going to reach in up along the top. I'll push that radiator back a little bit. Carefully grab onto the AC condenser, and we're going to start trying to pull these ears out from the back side here. Just push this back as far as we can. Sometimes just giving it a little bit of a stretch might help you a little bit. There it is, friends. Okay, friends, it's time to get ready to install our brand new air conditioning condenser. Now looking at the entire thing, you can see that you have a whole bunch of these little fins. As we're installing this, you want to be extremely careful not to go ahead and peen any of those over. That's going to cause restriction for airflow. Of course, if your radiator looks like this, located right behind it, go ahead and clean it down. Why would you leave it like this? Go ahead and use some compressed air and see if you can blow it through from the rear towards the front and try to get out as much of this as possible. Don't use your fingers and try to rub it because you'll peen over all these little tabs. Let's carefully start putting this in position. All right. Now the next thing we're going to do is grab our 4 mounting bolts for this. We'll go ahead and put them right on into the radiator there. Once they're all started, we can snug them up. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is go ahead and have some of your AC PAG oil at hand. What we need to do is have a look at the O-rings that go from the AC lines to where they're supposed to connect into the AC condenser. Typically, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace those O-rings. Either way, whether you're replacing them or just inspecting them and reusing them for some reason, use some of your PAG oil. Now let's just make sure they're nice and snug. Now that we have the AC condenser lines on there, let's continue on to these plastic pieces. For the one on the passenger side, you can see the area with the cutouts that need to go over the lines. Looking at it, you can also see the little tabs that need to fit into their corresponding holes. Let's line everything up. Gently press it in, listen for some clicks. There we are, we'll give it a tug, we'll make sure it's secure. Do the same on the other side. Now we can start putting on the bumper, but before we do, of course I'm going to want to pay attention to all of my mounting hardware. This is just for one side of that bumper. Of course I'm going to make sure that all my threading is good, I'm going to clean it, and then once everything's cleaned, I'll continue on with a little bit of red thread locker for each. Okay, this is looking good so far. Let's continue on by putting on our bumper here. Now looking along the top of the bumper, you can see that we have that bracket. Up along the front of the car, you have another bracket that comes down with those two mounting studs. We're going to go ahead and put the bracket that's on the bumper right over those mounting studs, and then of course we'll move along to putting in our side mounting bolts. Let's get our support in here. So now we're just going to shift the bumper around as needed so we can line up all of our mounting holes for each side. Let's start with our larger bolts with some of that red thread locker. Before I go ahead and start putting it in there, if you look at the bumper itself, generally you can see exactly where that bolt was sitting. Just keep that in mind as we start putting these in and when it's time to go ahead and tighten everything up. Now we can put in the ones on the other side as well. So now that we have both sides started in, let's continue on by tightening one of the bolts on each side. As I bring this to the point where it's about to be tight, I want to of course line up the bumper with the area that it was originally in. Like I said before, you can see looking at the bumper where the wear marks are for those locking washers. That's lined up perfectly. I'm going to pause on this side, do the exact same thing on the other side, and then we can tighten all of the bolts. Let's make sure they're nice and tight. Let's move along to each of our side bolts. Once again, looking at the bracket, you can see exactly where the original bolt was sitting on this. So once you start putting it in, just go ahead and move it into the proper position and then snug it up. Make sure they're nice and tight. Do the exact same thing on the other side. Now we can remove our support. Now let's go ahead and grab onto that AC condenser where it's mounted to the radiator. I'm going to go ahead and pull it, and as you can see inside this area right here, I've got the hole lined up. We can go ahead and take our mounting screw, we'll start it in there, do the exact same thing on the other side, and then tighten them up. Reconnect in your air temp sensor. Give it a wiggle, make sure it's completely secured. Let's make our way up here. We can start on both of our 10mm headed nuts. After that, snug them up. Okay friends, now it's time to install the bumper cover. Let's go ahead and take this and we're going to start putting it in position. As we're sliding it in place, you want to be very careful not to scuff your paint in any way. As you start lining up your mounting bolt holes, just go ahead and start in all 3 of your upper mounting bolts. Once you have all 3 of those started, make your way to each corner. We're going to be paying attention to where it comes along the bottom of the headlight. And then also, if you look along this area of the bumper cover, you're going to see several notches that should line up along this area directly along the fender. That right in there. Once it seems as though it's lined up, just give it a loving bonk. That's going to hold in once we put in our mounting bolts. Once you have each of the corners done, let's make our way back to our 3 bolts. We'll go ahead and put those in, and then we can make our way underneath the front of the vehicle. Now we can put in our corner screws. Let's put in our wheel well screws, making their way all the way down the line here. All right, do the same on the other side of the vehicle. Now while we're under here, we can reconnect in our fog lamps. Go ahead and take that. We're going to put it right up into place. Listen for a click. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Next, you're going to want to make sure the wiring's in position so it doesn't get caught on anything, and of course plug in the other side as well. Let's make our way underneath the bumper cover here. We can start resecuring it. Now that I have all the bolts started, let's go ahead and tighten them up. Now we can get our lower splash shield on here. A couple areas to pay attention to. Looking at these tabs, you can tell that they're very different. This one has a little flippy-do that faces towards me, and then of course the one next to it is going to face the opposite. And then it goes back and forth all the way down the line. Now also, looking at the larger one on each side, you're going to see that it has a little tab. That tab needs to line up with its corresponding hole. So now here we go. We're going to start putting this in position. You're going to notice that I have the tab with the flippy-do facing down coming along the bottom of this plastic. The areas where I'm facing up is going to go up along the top. Let's keep that in mind as we go down the line. Go ahead and slide it into position. After that, you can go ahead and take all 4 of your mounting bolts for each side, start them in there, and snug them up. Now I'll do the same on the other side. Now it's time to put the grill back on. Let's have a look at the back side. Now when I went ahead and took this off, I showed you that you have all these little tabs that go across the bottom. I also showed you on the bumper cover, you're going to find the areas that all of those tabs need to slide into. Now with that in mind, go ahead and line this up in position. We're going to slide in the bottom half and then we'll line up the upper bolt holes and put in all 4 of our top mounting bolts. Okay friends, we got our AC condenser back inside the vehicle. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to make sure that you recharge the AC system with the proper refrigerant and the proper amount. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test, make sure she's blowing cold. Thanks for watching.